I read The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell. This is Mitchell's sixth book, and I'm going to be talking about the previous 5 books and how they relate to this book. So if you don't want spoilers for David Mitchell's other books that come before this, then you should stop listening. The Bone Clocks is a literary fantasy book. I don't know how else to categorize it. I wouldn't say that it's a full-on fantasy book, but it is so close that maybe there's no difference for a lot of people. This did win an award for the World Fantasy Award when it came out in 2015 or 2014. Anyway, like when it came out, it won the World Fantasy Award. But because of its ending and some of its focus, I don't think that it's a full-on fantasy set in the real world that follows genre conventions of like an urban fantasy or a portal fantasy or something like that. It's very close, it's adjacent, but it's more of a literary novel. And I guess I'll try to dig into why I think that as I talk about it. The book is split into 6 different parts or stories with various narrators or points of perspective, but primarily I would say it's about one character, the first one that we meet, Holly Sykes, who is both the first and last narrator of the book, and then she appears in all of the subsequent stories. The book follows a linear path through time, so we begin in the 1980s and we end the book in the 2040s. And so this kind of follows Holly's lifespan by starting when she's a teenager and ending when she's a grandmother. I find that this ties in with his previous book, Black Swan Green, where we get a single year of one person's life as he transitions from boyhood to manhood. And yet I talked about how that 1 year kind of contains all of life, because we see like a baby being conceived and the baby's born. And then there's also like, there's the teenage years, the adult years, a marriage breaks up, there's elderly people, there's just all kinds of life being crammed into this 1 year of life. And in this novel, we have that experience spread out over the entire novel. I think this is Mitchell's longest novel also. And so the whole thing, instead of chronicling 1 year of Holly's life, it chronicles her entire life. And like Cloud Atlas's structure, where you had a single soul that was spread out across many different lifetimes, spanning a huge amount of time, probably centuries, you have Holly's lifetime, but the way that her psyche or her experience is constructed is in relation to many different people. And so she is who she is because she meets the narrator of the second part, Hugo Lamb, and she meets the narrator of the third part, Ed Brubaker, and so on and so on. So like who we are as people is influenced by the people that we meet. So again, I come back to this thing that I just keep talking about over and over, the polyphonous voice that David Mitchell has. I think this is kind of showing how we as individuals are made up of many different parts that come from all the different people that we meet. And of course, Holly has an effect on those other narrators, the men in her life in this case. They are changed and influenced and are different people because they meet her. In the same way, then who they are is changed by knowing Holly, and who they are is influenced by all of the other people that they know. And so by not staying in Holly's perspective, we see the ways that we are all similar to each other. It's not just in being well-rounded characters who have flaws, who have inner conflicts, who have things that they're good at, and all of that good stuff that makes for well-rounded characters. It has to do with the way that internally we are constructed as pieces of our parents, our friends, our enemies, everything in the world influences us and makes us who we are. We don't exist in a vacuum absent of those things. We exist because of those things, is kind of what the novel is saying, I think. So in Cloud Atlas, you had the different people that the soul would become. But in this case, we're seeing that one woman's soul is constructed of many different people, if you kind of get what I'm saying. So there's almost like an inversion that is happening in the context of what a person is. But I guess you could say that that was true of all of the individual experiences of the given soul in Cloud Atlas to begin with. So while there's a kind of formal construction inversion that's happening, it's an affirmation of the viewpoint that Mitchell seems to have of what people are. Anyway, that's all like a pretty cosmic 20,000 feet view of the story and of Holly herself. So let's dig into things a little bit closer by talking about the first part of the story that takes place in 1984, where Holly Sykes spends a night with her much older boyfriend in a attempt to rebel against her parents. And this leads to a series of events where she runs away from home, basically, because her mom confronts her about spending the night with her boyfriend, which is not allowed. And she's way too young to be doing that anyway. And we find out about her home life, where she has a brother, Jacko, who is a little bit weird and different. And she tells Jacko that she's going to run away from home. And he gives her a kind of weird labyrinth that he drew out and tells her to keep it no matter what and memorize it, and says goodbye to her in a very ominous way. And then she goes off and tries to survive for a while on her own, as in an attempt to punish her parents, especially her mother. Structurally, a thing that happens here is that you have all this like mundane occurrences in Holly's life. And I don't say that to be like, these are boring, but like, I think it's very interesting. I love Holly's story. It's very interesting to follow. It's well written. Her voice is so strong and clever. I love how tough Holly is. But the thing structurally in the story that happens is you have this mundane story, and then occasionally it gets invaded by these very bizarre paranormal instances, these just random scenes that seem to invade the story, and then they just immediately pull back out and we go right back to the mundane story without Holly commenting on it too much or taking too much notice. And it's very jarring, in other words. Like, there's a high level of contrast and there's a low level of awareness of how disruptive this would be to us as readers. There's no like explanation given as to why, for example, like Holly remembers that she had some kind of imaginary friend that she would dream about named Mrs. Constantine, and she would hear voices and she made a wish for her bully to be punished, and then the girl was like severely punished the next day. It seemed like, did Holly manifest this, or is it a coincidence, or is Miss Constantine real? And the story just like it drops this anecdote of backstory in our lap, and then it just moves on from it and continues with Holly running away from home. Then she runs into a lady named Esther Little, who's like fishing on a dockside and offers her a drink on a very hot day. And then a bunch of really bizarre stuff happens after she meets Esther, and it's as if she's caught in some kind of psychic war zone where all kinds of bizarre things that she can't explain are happening. She sees her little brother there for some reason. And then all of it is just like, oh, that's over. And now we're just back to a story of her like hitchhiking. She meets a couple who are political activists, and then they get murdered. And then she just forgets all of that happened, and on like that. So we have mundanity and then bizarre fantasy stuff happening, and there's no reconciliation in the text between those two things. We're not smoothing out, like Holly's not like, what is happening? The way that we usually get in an urban fantasy, like, for example, like Harry Potter or the Dresden Files or something like that, where a protagonist is pulled out of the normal world that we all live in into a more parallel kind of paranormal world where there are elves and magic and whatever. And they're like, oh my goodness, elves are real and magic is real. And they have to reconcile these two existences psychically. That never happens with Holly. She just kind of ignores the weird stuff and goes back to the normal stuff. Another thing that happens structurally here is we get to the end of the story. So Holly has run away. She has managed to get a job at a farm. She's a fruit picker, and she has no intention of going back to finish out her school year or tell her parents where she is. She wants to create problems where she's a missing person, and this creates, problems for her friends or former friends, the people who broke her heart, and also her parents. So she's trying to punish them by staying away. But what she finds out from her friend Ed Brubeck, who helped her both to get away and to get the job, is that her little brother Jacko is missing. And so the story ends with us finding out that Jacko is missing, and Holly quits her job to go back home. And then the story abruptly stops. And so a lot of what happens in this novel is punctuated by these very abrupt changes in the narrative and abrupt endings to the narrator's story. And so we're following along with Holly's story. It was like, okay, all of this is interesting. It's a little bit weird, but whatever. I'm along for the ride. The writing is really good. So let's go. And then boom, it's over. And we jump ahead about a decade, and we're in a completely different narrator. And it's like, whoa, what happened to Jacko? What happened to Holly? What about Ed Brubeck's dreams and ambitions? We're just in a totally different guy now. And the entire book is built on these abrupt changes. And I think it's part of why I would say it's not exactly a fantasy, because it wants to have this kind of psychic disruption for the reader, and it's not trying to smoothly do world building where you have a coherent alternate world that the reader can escape into. This is really pushing back on escapist tendencies that fantasy caters to in a lot of ways. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with escapism, and I don't think that Mitchell believes there's anything wrong with escapism, but I think that the novel wants you to feel very uneasy and a little bit trapped in these circumstances, because a big theme in the story is war. And this is really a book about war, I would say, much more than it is about fantasy. It just uses motifs of fantasy to make a metaphor out of war, if you will. So in the second part, like I said, we go into the perspective of Hugo Lamb. Hugo Lamb was a supporting character in Black Swan Green. He was the main character's cousin who was kind of posh and older. He came in as the cooler older cousin and was kind of a jerk, though. And when we get into his perspective, we can see that he has sociopathic tendencies. He's amoral. Everything, if you just saw Hugo Lamb from the outside looking in, he seems like a successful, compassionate, well-to-do guy who is setting himself up to do well in life. He's basically college age. He comes from an upper middle class family, and he has ambitions to be wealthy by the time he's in his 30s. And he's going to some of the best colleges in England. He's hooking up with, all of his friends are well networked, come from moneyed people, he's well connected, I guess is what I'm saying. But since we get to see from the inside, what we see is that Hugo doesn't really care about any of those friends, quote unquote, and he doesn't care about what's right or wrong. Even though he goes to an old folks home to read to an old man who's gone senile, the real reason that he's doing that, it's not an act of charity on his part or sentimentality or a real loving connection of any kind. It's to exploit the old man's inheritance that he would have given to his family in the form of rare stamps. And so Hugo has stolen those stamps and he's slowly selling them off in order to build up wealth for himself in the future under a pseudonym. He has various girlfriends who, like, he's sleeping with one of his friend's girlfriend and doesn't care that she's going to break up with his friend. He's setting up one of his friends to be basically robbed through a gambling addiction or a burgeoning gambling addiction. Since he's so young, he doesn't have one yet. But he's setting him up to have to sell off his sports car that he inherited, all while pretending that they're best buddies and everything is fine. But he's actually engineered the entire thing. Stuff like that. So we can see that he's very amoral, he's very sociopathic. He only cares about accumulating power and wealth, but at the same time, he is bothered by the fact that one day he's going to be an old man like this guy that he's stealing the stamps from, and that no matter what he does, he's going to get old and he's going to die. And so in one sense, he doesn't want to have a hard life of, doing labor, and he doesn't want to struggle in the way of being poor. And so all of this is about creating a comfortable life for himself, but he knows that he can't escape death. And so he finds all of it to be a little bit empty and meaningless too. No matter how powerful Hugo becomes, he will never be more powerful than his own mortality. And Hugo's not really interested in leaving any kind of legacy, since he doesn't feel connections to his family and his friends. He has a little bit of resistance to that idea that I was saying before about how we are all composed of other people and the circumstances in our life, that a person doesn't exist in a vacuum as an individual. We are made up of the people that we care about and the people, whether that, that care comes in the form of love or hate or whatever. You are composed of those other people and your relationships to them to some extent psychically or spiritually, if you prefer. But Hugo doesn't have those connections so much. And so he finds his life, the idea of even a wealthy, comfortable life to be meaningless, because there's the future is just going to come crashing to an end, and then he will cease to exist completely, because there are no connections for him to kind of move forward through children or friendships or whatever. Some of his friends that he sees here draw connections to the previous book with The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. We have Johnny Penhaligon, who seems to be descended from the antagonist at the end of the book. The Englishman who invades Dejima was Captain Penhaligon. So this is some part of his family, and that family has managed to work its way up to the House of Lords, probably because of their, his conquering as a English captain during the colonial era, right? So he helped to build the empire of England and was rewarded with governmental power. In the previous part, I didn't mention that Holly is cured of her seeming delusions of Mrs. Constantine by a doctor named Marinus, which is the same name that we had from the previous book also. Dr. Marinus was Jacob's friend, of course, and one of my favorite characters in the book. And so it's a repetition of that name, and you're like, oh, is it the same Marinus? Yes, indeed, it is the same Marinus. So we'll talk about the weird psychic lineage thing that's happening there. So again, there's these connections to the previous books, both in terms of just a mundane ancestral lineage and the connections that, like Hugo had in being the cousin to the protagonist of Black Swan Green, but also the more psychic, mystical, fantastical connections that seem to be happening throughout all of Mitchell's books. Hugo goes on a vacation to Switzerland where Holly is working in a bar or pub kind of situation. And then she's also, in her free time, she's out there skiing in the Alps. And her and Hugo strike up a kind of friendship and a tenuous romantic relationship when Hugo has to hide from some gangster type guys during a blizzard in Holly's apartment. And so they share a night together. Holly is not sure how she feels about him, but for Hugo, for the first time in his life, he falls in love with a woman. And he doesn't know how he feels about it. He's very alarmed at how jealous he feels all of a sudden about just all of these uncontrollable feelings because of this deep connection with Holly. And for him, this is a very kind of intrusive moment, in the same way that there these weird things would happen to Holly in the previous part. Now there's this a very emotional thing happening to him, and he's like, what is this? And he retreats from it very quickly. At the same time, there are some weird psychic things that happen to Hugo as well that he kind of drops out of or mentally turns away from because they're so weird that he can't believe in them. But his connection to Holly seems to be one of those things. This is the first hint, I think, in the story that we get. Well, that's not totally true. There's some other stuff before that, especially Jacko's maze that is given to Holly right up at the top of the story. That there's a kind of providence, or what's called in the story a script. And that part of the intrusiveness in the narrative, there's this mundane story that we could be telling that would just be a much more literary kind of story about Holly's life that doesn't have all of the fantastical psychic war elements to it. That narrative gets interrupted and intruded upon constantly by the script. And it's the same thing for Hugo. He is a sociopathic, amoral, kind of narcissistic guy, and that story gets interrupted by the necessity that he fall in love with Holly Sykes. No matter how unlikely that relationship would be, it needs to happen for the script to play out correctly, quote unquote, according to the parameters of its story. And this, again, it goes all the way back to Ghostwritten, right? With the call that Louisa Ray makes to the Bat Secundo show, where she talks about how all of us exist in a story and for the benefit of the story. Or in The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, how they talk about, are we playing Go or is Go playing us? When in Ghostwritten, Marco thinks about the difference between watching a game live on television and watching a taped version of the game later, how there's a spontaneity and a reality to the player's actions, but once you watch it taped, there's an inevitability. They're trapped within a script where they have to do particular things for the game to go exactly the same way every time. And so Hugo can't just be this isolated person out in the world. He has to cohere to the script. And that makes this very unlikely thing happen to him. But I don't want to skip over the even weirder thing that happens to him, that he is approached by Mrs. Constantine or Miss Constantine and some of her followers or whatever, the anchorites basically, come and introduce themselves to him and offer for him to join them. And they demonstrate some really weird psychic powers where they're able to pause time for him. So he's in one place and then he wakes up in another place and several days have passed. They're able to do all kinds of other things, like erase memories and whatever. But they like that he has this amorality, and that they offer to him like, hey, this problem that you're having with your mortality, well, actually, our fantastical powers have a way of dealing with that. We can give you everlasting life. And that's where his story breaks off. And so like if you're a fantasy reader, like even though you don't like this guy necessarily, you'd be like, oh, wow, now we're really digging into the fantasy. Here's the part where we're going to learn about the magical world. We have an access key character like Harry Potter going to Hogwarts. We're going to learn all the secrets. And boom, the narrative is done. We break off. We go to a new narrator in a new setting. We fast forward another decade or so. And boom, we're in Ed Brubeck's perspective, who has been a romantic partner of Holly Sykes for a long time, and they have a child together. And all of that supernatural stuff, that's over. We're not talking about that anymore. Now we're back in the mundane story. So again, we have this like up and down. There's like two stories kind of jammed together, and they don't nicely work together. It is as if they are at war with each other. And so I think in the very structure of the book, you have this conflictual relationship between the psychic, spiritual story that's happening over here and this mundane story of a woman's life over there. This more literary story and this more fantastical genre story. And they are being mashed together in a very conflictual way where they just don't mesh together nicely. And I don't think that's like some kind of accident or poor writing on Mitchell's part. I think it's very, very on purpose. We're supposed to feel uncomfortable with these transitions and the invasions that the weird psychic story has on the mundane story. It's part of the point. And this part in particular really gets into the war part of the narrative, because Ed Brubeck's whole job is that he is a journalist who goes to war zones and reports the truth of what's happening on the ground. So he's a kind of embedded reporter who doesn't just like go along with the soldiers in a highly protected convoy where, you know, he's taken care of and he's fed the government line and he reports the government line according to them. He goes out on his own, digs up stories, and is kind of like a real problem for the military people. Ed works for the American magazine Spyglass, which is the same place that Louisa Ray worked in Cloud Atlas. And in Cloud Atlas, Spyglass was kind of a tabloid. It's felt like they would just make up stories, you know, like, oh, it's the person who they had a baby and it looks like a bat kind of a story or whatever. But Louisa Ray wanted to do more hard-hitting reporting, like her whole thing about the nuclear power plant that was being covered up. And it seems like Spyglass, because of that story in particular, probably went more in that hard-hitting journalism direction. And so Ed Brubeck works for Spyglass doing hard-hitting reporting in the field during wartime. He's cultivated a couple of assets in the Iraq War. So this is happening during the Allied invasion of Iraq that's led by America and England as partners, along with a few other European nations. And they've overthrown Saddam Hussein, and they're looking at invading into Afghanistan. And Ed has cultivated a local reporter who's helping him and a local photographer. And they just kind of like take him out into the field and they try to find news every day. At the same time, so that's kind of like that whole thing is flashback, I guess. And the thing that's happening in the moment is that Ed is at a wedding for Holly's younger sister. And so he's having to navigate life as this high adrenaline war reporter, but now he's like in this very mundane situation where he's at a wedding and there's relatives who don't really like him or don't get him. He's a little bit bored. He also feels out of place because he's gone all the time being in Afghanistan and Iraq. His romantic partner, Holly, resents him for that. His child, Aoife, is kind of a stranger to him. She doesn't really know him very well. He just feels out of place in his own life. And he doesn't know if he's become addicted to the adrenaline of war, if he's just become a kind of curmudgeon, or if Holly just doesn't get him and she's not being a good partner and supporting him. He's in a weird place as a guy in his 30s, really starting to like succeed in a very difficult career, but at the same time trying to make it work romantically with a family. So the narrative jumps back and forth between wartime and peacetime. It makes a strong contrast between the people in England and the people in Iraq, just regular people trying to live their lives, but this war keeps like literally knocking down the door and bringing violence into their homes. And then meanwhile, back in England, people are complaining about the war. They're complaining about the regular Iraqi people being like, why don't they get it? Why don't they just do what we tell them to do? So there's echoes of the colonialism that is explored in Cloud Atlas and the kind of sketching of communities that was talked about in Black Swan Green about like, oh, the savages are over there, which makes us the civilized people because, you know, that contrast that we draw between the other and ourselves. So thematically, there's some connections there to the previous books. But this one really gets in your face about the violence of war, where wars come from, which has to do with like the very strong political beliefs of the soldiers involved, the politicians who are sending them off there, the lack of planning that the political leaders have, and how dangerous that is. All of that's going to come back to the people in England by the end of the book. So this book is written around, like I said, 2014. It would have been during the war. So the war would have been going on for more than a decade by the time that Mitchell is really getting into the guts of writing this book. And of course, he's an Englishman, and so his country is directly involved in the choices of the Bush administration and the American military complex and its various reasons for being involved in Iraq and how it's very two-faced about those things. And so his sense of injustice and the immorality of the war, I think, is showcased here. But it's also not just there to be like, oh, here's a political pill to swallow wrapped up in this story. I think he's saying something deeper about the instability that we are creating in our global culture. Like we've managed to globalize the human community in the 20th century. And now that we're in the 21st century, we're going to reap what was sown 100 years ago, if you will, in terms of like, we're doing these world wars, we're doing these colonialisms, where part of the world is just going in and extracting resources and not paying attention to the cultures and experiences of the people that we're doing that to, and thinking that it's just, not only do we have every right to do it, but that it's not going to come back on us at all. And I think when you look at the long stretch of history, that's simply not true. These things always come back. And so the the book is trying to situate the war not as a response to barbarism that happened in the United States that is kind of proportional to, like stopping people from attacking America, attacking civilization and modernity. It's not that. It's part of a larger cycle that is going to be harmful to the civilization, that like it's a choice to start a war, and that war has a life of its own. And it's what war does to people is you're having a mundane, normal existence where you care about your family, your friends, your lovers, and then all of a sudden this enormous mind-warping violence crashes into your life and people die, things change irrevocably, and there's nothing that you can do about it. The most precious people in your life are just torn away from you, and there's chaos because of it. Because a part of who you are is ripped out of you when that happens, according to the kind of psychological picture that's being presented in the book, right? We are composed of other people, and so when we lose someone, a part of us is ripped out. And that's what war does to people. It just rips people away, and there's no sense to it. There's no reason for it. It's very difficult to cope with, and it's almost impossible to get over because the war destroys everything. It destroys places, it destroys jobs, it destroys infrastructure. And so all there is the war. This is the kind of thing that Ed tries to explain to people over wedding cake when they're asking him why the Iraqis behave the way that they do and why they can't just get with the program and be more like the English and the Americans. After the wedding happens, the whole thing is happening in a hotel, and everybody is staying in various rooms in the hotel. And little Aoife, who's like 5 or 6 years old, goes running off on her own when Ed falls asleep taking a nap. And she gets herself lost, and Ed wakes up and realizes that she's gone, and Holly starts panicking, and everybody in the family starts trying to find Aoife. And this is, in a very mundane way, in a very safe way, the exact thing that I was just talking about that war does to us, where it just rips people out of our lives. And Ed goes through an experience that every parent has been through, where you don't know where your child is and you panic. But this whole thing is interrupted by a psychic episode that Holly has, where she starts spouting out some numbers. Ed realizes that maybe those numbers correspond to a room in the hotel that they're staying in. He goes and checks it out, and indeed, Aoife is in that room. And so the crisis is kind of closed, and it's okay. The person that he could have lost is restored to him. But it's a glimpse into how that script happens once again, right? That Holly saw where Aoife is according to the script, and Aoife should be with her family. She needs to be with them for the script to work. And so Aoife is restored to them. And even though Ed doesn't believe in this psychic stuff that is happening with Holly, he has to admit that something definitely happened. This kind of bridges the emotional gap that's been between Holly and Ed for this part of the story. And it seems like it heals their family to a certain degree. Ed was offered to go back to the war, but we find out later that he refuses and doesn't go back, at least for a while, and becomes a better husband and a better father because of Aoife getting lost and this kind of psychic connection thing happening. He's able to accept his partner a little bit better. And I mean, I called him a husband, but they're not married, but he basically is Holly's marriage partner. But you get the idea of what I'm saying, that Ed invests more heavily in the family, but we don't exactly see that because the narrative cuts off very abruptly once again, and we jump into a completely different man another 10 or 15 years in the future named Crispin Hershey, who is a writer on the international level, really. He's beloved in England as the wild child of English writing. He is just kind of the guy who says whatever's on his mind. He doesn't have a filter. Crispin Hershey's a lot of fun to read, I think, but he's not a great guy. He's very rude, and he's very vindictive. In particular, there was a guy who was introduced earlier in the book as a friend of Hugo Lamb named Richard Cheeseman, who is a literary critic at this point and an aspiring novelist himself. He writes a scathing review of Hershey's new book, which Hershey feels kind of ruins the book's chance of hitting the market and being a big hit for him once again. He had a really big first novel, and he's never been able to repeat that success since then. And this was supposed to be the book that was supposed to push him back over the edge again, maybe even do better than the first book. But that doesn't seem to be happening, and Crispin blames Richard for this. He ends up framing Richard for having cocaine. He calls into the airport and tells the inspectors, hey, this guy's going to have cocaine. He's coming in on this day for this flight. And Richard gets pulled aside and thrown in prison as a drug trafficker, which was not exactly Crispin's plan, but does ruin Richard's life. While Crispin is on his book tour, he meets Holly Sykes, who has written a book of her own about her childhood psychic experiences, as well as the fact that her little brother Jacko disappeared and never came back to the family. So when her story ended in the beginning and Ed Brubaker showed up and was like, hey, Jacko's gone, come to find out, Jacko never returned and we don't know what happened to him. And so the book is kind of an attempt by Holly to reach out into the world and see if, Jacko or somebody that Jacko knows reads the book, then he would be able to reconnect with his family, because that loss is something that was ripped out of Holly and can't be replaced. And the same for her family. So it's a part of them that they would like resolution about. They don't know if Jacko's still alive or if he died or what happened to him at all. Hershey is very contemptuous of Holly's book because it has all this psychic mumbo jumbo in it. And he thinks that she is basically just exploiting weak-minded people with all of this nonsense. However, over time, the two of them become friends, and he sees Holly do some pretty weird psychic stuff, and he has to admit eventually, much like Ed Brubaker before him, that this psychic stuff seems to be real. And speaking of Ed, Crispin and Ed knew each other a little bit, and it turns out that eventually Ed did go back to a war zone and he died. And Aoife has grown up and she's going off to college now. And Crispin also has some kids, and he's in the same place as Holly, dealing with estrangement from his children as they grow up and don't need him anymore. But at the same time, he has such bad behavior and he's so self-involved and a bad romantic partner that his wife has divorced him and moved on. And so he's, that's a different kind of violence that's happening to him in terms of like losing people that you love. But I think it's really self-inflicted, and we're supposed to kind of enjoy it as readers because he does a lot of bad behavior and that produces bad results in his life. So there's a kind of satisfaction that has to do with like karmic justice or something, right? At the same time, we still get that structure that happens where the narrative, this mundane narrative about a man going through basically a midlife crisis, where his career is maybe spiraling down, his romantic life is falling apart, he gets a younger girlfriend and gets her pregnant. All of the kind of cliched midlife crisis of a successful man stuff is happening to Crispin, but it's interrupted and punctuated by these psychic invaders, the anchorites, come into his life and ask him about his connection to Holly Sykes. Hugo Lamb shows up and kind of tortures him, trying to find out what he knows about Holly, what he knows about a war with a group of people called the Horologists. And all of it's very mysterious and weird. And then as soon as it's over, Crispin just forgets about it. It doesn't exist anymore. So there's that kind of jagged intrusion into the narrative, like I talked about, very conflictual, feels like two different stories happening. And then at the same time, there's this woman who comes around trying to get Crispin to read her poetry that happens 3 different times. And she's talking about a secret war that's happening, and he just kind of blows her off because it's too weird to be real. And during all of that time, Crispin is trying to assuage his personal guilt over getting Richard Cheeseman thrown in jail over his bad review with the cocaine that he planted on him by being the head of a campaign to get Richard freed from South American prison and extradited to England. And eventually he achieves this, and Richard is sent back to England, where he goes to an English prison for a very short time and then is let free. But by this time, Crispin's life has kind of fallen apart. He's lost all of his success. He hasn't published a new successful book at all. He hasn't even written anything really. He's lost his home. He's lost his wife and his kids. He lost his girlfriend even. And he's forced to take a teaching job. But it turns out that he's like much happier with this low stress lifestyle where he would like to have a better job, but he doesn't feel all this pressure to live up to this persona that he built for himself with the success of his first book. But right around the time that he would maybe be offered a full-time position teaching, the poet for one thing, the Richard Cheeseman tracks him down and threatens his life. He has figured out what Crispin did to him, and he kind of holds him at gunpoint. And there's a very tense moment of like, is he going to die? And Cheeseman makes a decision to let him live. There's a short story that explains this sudden change of heart in a very interesting way. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to read it, but you should, if you don't know what I'm talking about and you're interested in this book, you should go track it down, because it's a really fascinating expansion of Mitchell's psychic war universe stuff. But in any event, Cheeseman leaves him to his existence. So there's, this violent invasion once again into the mundane life, but then it's just kind of like broken off suddenly. And then the poet comes back and talks to him about the script. Her name is Soleil Moore, and she talks about the script and how he's a part of it, and how there's a secret war between the horologists and the anchorites, and there's vampires and all of this stuff. And Crispin just can't believe it and tells her to get out, and she kills him as a way to try and create a story that people will care about him dying because he was this famous novelist, and then they'll care about her work because she'll be there with her book, and that book will explain to people about the secret war that's happening. And it reminds me of Cloud Atlas and the way that I talked about how genre narrative was able to move through time and influence society itself to the point where it kind of got rid of these bad colonialist imperial tendencies in human beings, where exploitation is necessary to build the society that we have. And all of that kind of came from this ability to transmit stories through the centuries, and how that is a really powerful tool to change human destiny. And it seems like Soleil Moore believes in the same idea, but is a little bit maybe grandiose about her own work and the possible influence that it could have on people. And she's kind of discounting, I think, the possibility that her work could interrupt the script that she seems to be aware of, that the script might be impervious to that kind of thing because it is so deterministic. It is so taking control of people and their place in the narrative, whether they fit in to that or not. And so she might not have the ability, or storytelling itself might not have the ability to combat this thing because the script is a story, is kind of what I'm saying. So like it can't abide for another story to fight against it, because in any case, nobody cares about this. It doesn't expose anything at the end of the day. That's not the thing that brings down the anchorites. And so Crispin's story ends in violence, and it seems to be adjacent to this secret war that's happening. And so he's a casualty of this war. His life ends suddenly because of the violence of this war. And so this is the closest, I think, that we've come in the book so far to war actually like affecting someone so directly. The narrative jumps forward again to 2025, which at the time, again, that he's writing this is more than a decade in the future. And so it's a little bit funny or weird to read this now because there are like various science fiction type predictions that are made that didn't really shake out now that we're past 2025 to read this. But that's fine. Like, it doesn't hurt my ability to believe in the story or understand it, in its own terms or anything, but it's just kind of interesting what did happen and what didn't. There's a lot of like self-driving cars, or the way that you start cars doesn't have to do with like keys or fobs or anything like that. It's voice commands, little things like that, that in a way almost make it its own world and don't throw me out, but actually like draw me a little bit more into it. But I don't think that was Mitchell's intention when he did that, but it's how it kind of works for me. This part of the book is from the perspective of Marinus, who is, again, the same Marinus that was in the 10,000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, which took place way back in the 1800s. And so this is a soul that is reincarnated again and again and perfectly remembers all of its previous incarnations. The way that this works is that the soul is incarnated into somebody who is a male, and then next time a male, female, and it could be anywhere in the world. So sometimes it's like in Russia or China or England or wherever. So we find out that Marinus is part of a group called the Horologists, who are in a secret war that is happening with the group, the Anchorites. And so this is the psychic war that's been bubbling underneath the surface. This part of the book is the most fantastical, the most immersed in fantasy. We get very typical, I would say, modern fantasy tropes here, where we learn rules about magic systems, and then the narrative drama rests on the manipulation of those rules that we come to understand. And so magic is not like this fuzzy kind of force over here that is esoteric and unknowable. It's very concrete and can be manipulated. It has costs, it has limits, and all of that rule making around it allows it to generate drama in the story. This is how modern fantasy is told. It's not like fairy tales where a magical creature shows up and changes the way that the world works. The characters have to manipulate a knowable magical system in order to achieve their goals. And so it's almost like an extension of physics or technology. What we find out is that the Anchorites have been harvesting the souls of small children and then using that soul energy to perpetuate their own youth and life. So this is exactly what was happening in Dejima in the 10,000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet with Enomoto and his shrine, where they were sacrificing baby souls and then drinking them somehow, in imbibing them in a kind of black wine is what they call it in this book, and extending their own lives. And so this is exactly the deal that they told Hugo Lamb about. Hey, we'll help you live forever. This kind of solves your mortality problem. And it's where we get the name of the book, The Bone Clocks. It's what the anchorites call humans as like a negative kind of slam, that they are just ticking time bombs of mortality, that they'll become skeletons eventually. So we find out Marinus's backstory about how they are reborn again and again, but also how they have been a part of this society of horologists and the circumstances of the war. They had a friend and teacher in the person of Esther Little, who is not reborn again and again, but is a sojourner, kind of like in Ghost Written, there was the Mongolian sojourner who could move from body to body. That seems to be what Esther Little is capable of. But Esther was lost along with some other members of horology back in Holly's story at the beginning of the book, in the kind of moments that Holly didn't understand. That was actually a battle between the horologists and the anchorites, where the horologists tried to destroy their shrine, their temple, but failed. Esther was killed in this, or so they believed. But what it actually seems like happened is that Esther somehow psychically took refuge in Holly Sykes, and that she has laid out various clues for Marinus about how to bring her back, and that there needs to be a second attempt made on the anchorites, and that this attempt will be definitive one way or another, and that the entire thing, including the previous Lost, has been scripted. And so this is the narrative that has been conflicting with the mundane narrative of the novel throughout the entire thing. So we're kind of in the heart of the scripted narrative, the fantasy narrative. And this whole thing plays out in a very typical fantasy way. You have good guys and bad guys, good and evil. They have similar but opposite powers. The anchorites talk about a counter script. So they believe in a deterministic future as well, but their deterministic future leads to their success, where the horology script leads to horology's success. So it feels like almost very Star Wars-y to me, like the dark side of the Force, the light side of the Force. Everything is very Manichaean. We get ideas of the anchorites being predators, of being meat eaters, and the horologists are vegetarians. This recalls the idea to me in Cloud Atlas of the weak are meat, the strong do eat. So you have the exploiters in the anchorites and the underclass in the horologists. And the horologists are just by nature immortal. They don't have to do anything to be immortal. That's just part of who they are, what they are. And the anchorites are unnaturally immortal. And that seems to be the main difference to me, this kind of unnaturality versus a natural kind of immortality. And that it's not even like something that Marinus necessarily wants. It's just an aspect of themselves that they have accepted. But they could see it like kind of as a curse, I guess. The purpose that they find in their shared existence as horologists is to hunt down people like this and put a stop to them. And so these are the terms of the war, that the anchorites want to groom and exploit regular people in order to perpetuate their own lives, and the horologists are trying to put a stop to that and protect regular people from being predated on. One of the horologists who died in the previous battle was Gilo, who was secretly Jacko, Holly Sykes' little brother, who disappeared. And that's the reason that he disappeared, because he died in the conflict, or so everyone believes. Holly is pulled into this whole thing, so we find out about how her life has been going at this part of her life. Aoife has grown up and has a serious romantic relationship with a man who lives in Iceland. Holly has become a best-selling author once again, but she has gotten cancer. Miraculously, she was able to kind of beat cancer because it seems like she was needed for the script, and so her cancer went away because of that. She hasn't involved herself in any romantic relationships since Ed's death. She was very good friends with Crispin, and she mourns his passing, but her life these days seems to be about Aoife, but Aoife has kind of moved on. And so when Marinus comes back into her life, she's forced to confront all of the weirdness that happened when she was a kid and the pain of losing Jacko. And this whole thing seems to be a way to answer the questions that were brought up in her book that she wrote. What happened to Jacko? What was all of that psychic stuff about? This is going to bring a close for Holly to all of the paranormal experiences that she's had throughout her life. And indeed, they managed to break into the Anchorites' stronghold and destroy their capability to extract souls from children and put an end to their whole thing. But in the course of doing this, they're going to be trapped and they're all going to die, except that Jacko or Gilo built into the entire thing with like his dying act was to turn his own soul or psychic existence into the maze that he gave to Holly as like an actual place. And at the center of the maze is a way back to the mundane world. And Holly knows how to navigate the maze because of the puzzle that Jacko gave to Holly when she ran away from home. And so in the way, like the whole thing is like scripted, right? Like she was given the answer at the beginning of the story before she could understand the context of that answer. This happens in fantasy a lot where like Dorothy gets the slippers at the beginning of the story and they are the answer to her problem at the end of the story, right? The One Ring comes to Frodo and it's the key to destroying evil in Middle-earth at the end of the story, right? So like this often happens in fantasy where the key to things is given to the protagonist at the beginning of the story and then they use it at the end of the story. Of course, this isn't the end of the story, which is why I say that I don't think that this actually follows the fantasy conception, and like I don't think that it neatly fits into the fantasy genre, but I think that's on purpose because it's almost as if there are two different stories being mashed together in this one book. In any case, Holly follows the labyrinth because she knows it so perfectly, and she's able to navigate her way to the center, and there's like a golden apple there, and she touches it, and it zaps her out back into the mundane world, and so she is saved. But this story is from the perspective of Marinus, so while Marinus witnesses all of that happen, they're left there in the maze. And what you come to find out is that Hugo Lamb followed them all the way to the center here. And you would think that Hugo Lamb, being an amoral sociopath and someone who has murdered lots of people, he would have no problem with murdering Holly and taking this way out. But he doesn't. And why doesn't he do that? Well, it's because he fell in love with her in that night in Switzerland. And that love was scripted so that Holly would be able to find an escape in this moment. But it was also scripted so that Marinus would be able to escape as well. Because as a member of the Anchorites, Hugo has the unique ability to teleport out of this place, which Marinus doesn't have access to. So it's kind of like a dark side of the Force power that the light side of the Force doesn't have access, if you will. And so Marinus is able to escape, and we go into the final part of the book, which takes place in the 2040s. So again, we jump forward another couple decades, and Holly is an old woman who's living in Ireland, and the world has become a kind of post-apocalyptic landscape. Oil is extremely scarce. Electricity is hard to generate. There's a nuclear power plant, which has gone critical, and things are breaking down. And society is in a kind of ruinous state. And it's as if Ireland has become like Afghanistan was during the early 2000s, basically. And all of the extractive kind of policies of Western countries have come back to visit them harshly as China is ascendant, and the oil states that still have oil directly under the ground are able to function in a quote unquote normal modern way, but places like Ireland aren't able to do that. And you see like bandits come and destroy the town. They rob Holly and her friends. Mo Montevere from Ghost Written is here. So this seems to be the same island that she was on with her son and her blind husband, but they don't seem to be around anymore. And Holly is here with her granddaughter and a boy that she's adopted, and they are the most precious thing to her now. And there's a kind of like turning of things to where it's like we're in the circumstances of the beginning of the book, except that Holly is in the position that her mother was, and her granddaughter is in the position that she was. And so like there's a turning of the generations that happens here, but a nice kind of circularity to the story where Holly ran away from home as a way to punish her mother and her family. Ultimately, her granddaughter is going to leave Ireland, and it's going to be painful for Holly, but she's going to be grateful that this happens because it means that her granddaughter is going to live a safe life away from the insanity and breakdown of society that's happening in Ireland, because she's going to be whisked away by Marinus to Iceland, where things are more stable. And so what was in the beginning of the book a kind of bad circumstance of your child breaks up with you and runs away, Holly is happy about this happening for her granddaughter and her adopted grandson. And in this part of the narrative, the structure, I think, of the entire book is kind of inverted, because you have this mundane story of the breakdown of modern society and of our Western culture, and kind of the seeds that we've planted have come to fruit, and they're hurting Holly's life and her family's life. But all of that is broken into by this psychic fantasy narrative of Marinus showing up once again. But instead of like a bizarre violence that the story has to kind of like pass over or try to just ignore, it actually becomes like the resolution, and there's a real knitting together of the two parts of the story that happens right here at the end, where this invasive psychic story ceases to be invasive and instead is restorative and a way to create escapism and relief, which is what fantasy typically does for its audience. It's a way for the granddaughter to escape from the insanity of war into a more peaceful existence, in exactly the way that fantasy is usually a way for the reader to escape from the difficulties of regular life. So it offers in the narrative the actual kind of catharsis that is offered in real life. And it's almost as if the genre like subsumes the mundane story itself. There's a sadness and pessimism to the ending of the novel, but I think it's meant to be a kind of moral warning about the way that our society operates, about the anxieties that Mitchell himself has about our culture and the way that we're using the resources that we have, the kind of future that we are constructing for ourselves, but also for our children and grandchildren going forward, right? And the kind of world that they will inherit. And so I don't know that Mitchell sees an inevitability to, like, there will be a bad future, that it is kind of scripted, that it is put in stone, but he's putting that anxiety into his stories and the kind of moral trouble that it creates for us, because I think that's a real thing that he's concerned about. But if you look at the larger story that's being constructed between the 6 books that I've talked about so far, you'll see that there are clear contradictions, because we have the inclusion of Mo Monteverdi in this part of the story, who was the primary architect of the Zookeeper AI in Ghostwritten, which both protected the world but also maybe handed it over to an apocalyptic ending in the comet striking the Earth and ending all of civilization and of life. But also in Cloud Atlas, that clearly could not have happened, because society is able to go to the point where there's a civilization that perfects fusion technology and has a boat that goes around chronicling the post-apocalyptic existence of people after the collapse of globalism, and having like an anthropological project of observing these remnants of human society. And it seems like that might be the beginning of that society here with Marinus, and with Lorelei and Rafik, the grandchildren of Holly Sykes, that they might be the beginning of that project that we see in Cloud Atlas. But probably not exactly, because that they're going to Iceland, which is largely a white society, and that group was almost all Black people. And so it's not clear, like, in other words, the story is not lining up very nicely across the books. There are clear contradictions. And I think that's not like some kind of mistake on Mitchell's part, but instead contradicts this idea that exists here in the Bone Clocks about there being a script, that there is a hard determinism to his universe. There isn't. Each book has its own continuity and its own kind of improvisable existence, that it exists in a particular moment where the characters are alive and able to have agency and to change things, in exactly the way that Marco talked about the players on the pitch are able to be improvisable and, have control over the ball and do this and that. And that only after the event has been filmed, that is when it becomes deterministic. And so in the moment of the narrative, in the moment of the book, as we're reading it, the entire thing is alive in a way that it doesn't exist according to this deterministic plan that has to cohere to the other books. There are connections between the books, but there is not a strong determinism that is emanating between them. And so the books themselves become their own voices in a joined narrative that are themselves polyphonous and joining together as separate, distinct voices that are all in conversation with each other and building a kind of uber novel that is composed of those different but contradictory parts, if that makes sense. And so it's a very weird narrative experiment. I've never seen anybody try to do this thing. There are certainly writers who have many, many books that connect together and that are from many different perspectives, but they don't tend to deliberately contradict each other. Those tend to be like plot hole mistakes. But it's clear that there is no zookeeper in this narrative, but here is Mo Monteverdi, the inventor of Zookeeper, in the narrative. And so there's no attempt to reconcile that contradiction within the Bone Clocks. The contradiction exists on purpose, I think, in order to draw a distinction between, like, it's not saying this is an alternate universe version of Ghostwritten. They are clearly connected. Mo Monteverdi exists in both stories. Spyglass exists in Cloud Atlas and in the Bone Clocks. We're supposed to understand that Marinus is from the 10,000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. Like, all of these things are actually connected to each other, but they are not connected in deterministic ways. And so the relationship to the whole thing is not providential and scripted. That scriptedness is actually a kind of irritant within the narrative, I think, in exactly the way that our experience of this novel is like, oh, here's this mundane literary story, and then boom, it's invaded by this more genre fantasy story. And so while the world has this wider psychic mystery element to it, it's not there as a wider, like an over controlling factor to the whole thing. I think it's an element that is kind of a metaphor or an expression of a more mysterious feeling that we have as people about the world and our connections to other people. At least that's how I feel it in the story. Like, I do take it literally that there are psychic people and there's body hopping people and all of this stuff. Like, it's all real. But at the same time, that's a metaphorical expression of what it feels like to experience a synchronicity in your own life, or to have serendipity happen and you meet people at one point in your life and then you meet them again randomly later. And oh my God, we still have this connection. And that's a weird thing to experience in your real life. And so it's expressed in the story in these magical psychic terms. So we had this idea in the previous book of a kind of script, right? That the bad things that happened in Jacob de Zoet's life and Arito's life happened because it helped them to bring an end to the evil that Enomoto was perpetrating on the innocent people in his shrine. And that, so maybe that scriptedness could be a good thing. And I think this book examines the various scripts that are laid out for us by society. And those scripts are often violent, and they are often involve exploitation and war. And those scripts are highly invasive to the normal, just human experience of growing up, falling in love, and leaving a legacy of people that you care about and who care about you. War and these scripts destroy that and invade it and warp it and change it. And every once in a while, yeah, they can save us and pull us out of the fire at the last second. But that happens far more rarely than the way that they tear our lives apart. And so you have this conflict again between love and war that Mitchell keeps coming back to. And in this case, war is sided with the scripting or the providence of the story, the way that the story introduces conflict in our lives and can tear us apart. And some people are victims of that in the story, like Crispin Hershey, but some people get to slip through the cracks, like Holly Sykes and Lorelei and Rafik. So his universe is about the violence of things and the hope and the love and how those conflict with each other. But there's a darkness to it. And I think that darkness will continue in the next book, which is much, much shorter than this book. This book is so long. Slade House is a kind of horror story, and that will be the next book.